My name is Devin Matthews. I'm head of programs at Rainbow Road, and we're really excited to be here today, joined by some esteemed colleagues to discuss some really important topics as it relates to the persecution of LGBTQI plus forcibly displaced persons. Today, we celebrate a historic milestone. For the first time, the Human Rights Council received a dedicated report on the forced displacement of LGBTQI plus persons during the Human Rights Council on Friday. This is a long overdue recognition of a global crisis that has remained under-acknowledged for far too long. We are facing an unprecedented scale of displacement. 1 in every 69 people globally is forcibly displaced, and LGBTQI plus individuals are uniquely vulnerable within this landscape, often targeted not only by state actors, but also by families, communities, and systems that criminalize their very existence. Over 60 countries still criminalize same-sex intimacy, with 12 imposing the death penalty. And yet, the pathways to protection is very narrow. Less than 5% of refugees in need of resettlement were resettled last year, and in countries of first asylum, LGBTQI plus forcibly displaced persons often continue to face violence, homelessness, food insecurity, and a lack of access to help. The promise of safety remains out of reach. While the UNHCR estimates that 37 countries formally recognize asylum on SOGI grounds, in practice, we know that protection remains inconsistent and discretionary, undermining the universality of refugee law. In January 2025, the U.S. administration suspended the refugee admissions program, halting the processing of cases, including LGBTQI plus individuals already approved for resettlement. Simultaneously, foreign aid cuts disrupt critical services, and sweeping policy rollbacks strip away protections for trans and gender lovers to needs. In this context, the demand for support has surged. In 2024, the organization that I represent today, Rainbow Road, received over 13,000 requests for help. Over 2/3 came from individuals still in their countries of origin, unable to access asylum systems that are increasingly inaccessible or hostile. More than half of those supported identified as trans or gender diverse. The top safety concern reported was community rejection, a stark reminder that persecution begins at home and often continues in the context of displacement. Despite these barriers, we were able to respond. Last year, we supported nearly 6,000 individuals, evacuated 242 from 29 different countries, and helped 60 LGBTQI plus refugees access safety through novel resettlement pathways in Canada and the United States, and partnered with over 24 LGBTQI plus organizations in 18 countries, referring 260 individuals for resettlement to Canada alone. To advance systemic change, we launched the Queer Forced Displacement Initiative, a global network of leaders with lived experience, grassroots organizations, researchers, governments, and international agencies working together to expand protection and durable solutions. Building on prior communities co-hosted by the UNHCR and the independent expert, the QFTI roundtables have taken place in Mexico, South Africa, and Thailand, with an academic symposium that's planned for August in Mexico. We have received 59,000 requests for help since our origin, and supporting more than 20,000 people fleeing violence and persecution. And our work is grounded in the belief that no one should be forced to choose between their identity and their safety. This belief is powerfully reflected in the leadership of Graham Reed, the UN independent expert on SOGI. Graham has been a consistent and principled voice for LGBTQI plus people on the move, and an invaluable partner to Rainbow Railroad and other civil society actors advancing this work. His report reaffirms what we already know, that LGBTQI plus people face systemic targeted threats and that our international protection mechanisms must evolve to meet those realities. Let today be a turning point. We cannot address the global displacement crisis without addressing the specific needs of LGBTQI plus forcibly displaced persons. We are here not only to listen, but to act. I'm going to now introduce some of my colleagues here. So first, I'm going to be joined by Gurchan Sandhu, Director of Programs at NGOs.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Distinguished guests and delegates, Bill Gobald welcomes and congratulates the independent expert on this report, pressing one of the most pressing issues facing LGBT communities worldwide. Family rejection, criminalizing laws, economic marginalization, hate speech, and violence are key drivers forcing LGBT people to flee their countries and also much. External factors like humanitarian crisis and climate change further increase their vulnerability to forced displacement feeling. With the support of our membership, about 2,000 plus membership, we responded to the civil society call for submissions, highlighting these root causes. We emphasized how the lack of legal protections, absence of anti-discrimination laws, and inadequate policies in employment, healthcare, and education, as well as deepened marginalization, and often push LGBT people to seek safety elsewhere. In addition to funding cuts to civil society have increased securitization of migration, and the weaponization of cultural wars against trans people have created a hostile environment. In this climate, the promise of sanctuary is fading, forcing trans refugees to navigate a world that treats them as political twins or disposable lives, rather than as people deserving of dignity, rights, and protection. We fully support the report's conclusions and recommendations, particularly the vital role of states in providing meaningful support to displaced LGBT persons, ensuring access to basic needs, integration into new communities. We note with serious concern how some states have rolled back protections for asylum seekers, as well as LGBT persons, and our work in civil society organizations is being undermined by current global efforts to cut humanitarian and development aid. More than ever, there is an urgent need to continue supporting humanitarian programs and development programs, including those that provide specialized support to CSOs working with LGBT persons. More than ever, there is also a need for civil society to strengthen our collaboration, our coordination, to enhance our dialogue and learn from one another and reduce competition for funding. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now I'd like to introduce Alvaro Ayala, from the Colombian Mission and representative of Group Brandon.
Nanti, itu semua itu kalau diberikan itu for design to is second. I think that big habits with a lot their tumors when it comes to that. Yes, they happen. Overcome the big challenges and now being one of the biggest branches of the system that implants and the human rights example system that be under that. And in 2011, I remember, and the Colombian delegation gave a German statement on behalf of 82 delegates. And then they called. We called for an national violence and discrimination against people because of their intersectional orientation or gender identity. Right after my ambassador finished reading the statement and eligibility, I pointed out the finger into our suit and say, Ambassador, that don't make some go back to church and to delegate, and we should recover this girl back. At the same time, another ambassador banned the dance and stream. This is against NAT. That goes to those and Yes, well, we have a special reporter at Police House on Monday. But we have to preserve it. And we have to preserve it in times when the system is in a big crisis, when we have even a pushback. And there are the serious threats to the guarantee to the protection and to the rights of the LGBT and to plus a person where they still with it and faced the challenge because of the trends, the violence and the discrimination against people on the grounds of sexual orientation and gender brain. Many of these persons and many people living in my country had to run away from their homes, their belief, their lives, to forget about everything and start life in a new place. Trying to for them key to for protection. And unfortunately, the system now has less resources in protection to this person. And to the financial crisis of your white, and that's not fair. And never fair because For some of us, in my case, I consider to be a lucky one. A lucky one that had the privilege to marry to a wonderful guy and to have a normal life. Even coming from a country with the problems people get out. But I know that for many people it's not like that. And then go through things like that. That's not fair. So we have to try to do present what we have here and do that. And don't allow them which back to take all what we have actually.
Thank you so much. Next, I'm going to introduce Artemis Apuri, Executive Director of the Afghan LGBT organization.
Hello, everyone. I hope you're doing well. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm hearing this side debate. First of all, I want to welcome the independent experts' report. It was very tightly entitled, almost reporting not this report. The reports covered various issues, various kinds of issues regarding the post-displacement of LGBTQI people. But I want to highlight one of the aspects of the post-displacement, which is the border violence, which I also experienced a few years ago. A few years ago, when I escaped from my country, I was persecuted and I wanted to save my life. And I tried to escape to Turkey and then cross the border. And I did it with the help of smugglers, but I faced pushbacks and border violence brutally. And since that time, I spoke with many LGBTQI people who have been beaten, have been sexually harassed, sexually assaulted at the border. They experienced pushbacks and persecution at the borders. Not only at the Turkish borders, but also at the EU borders, we have these brutal pushbacks and border violence. I talked with especially LGBTQI women and trans women. They experienced pushbacks at the borders. I talked with various transgender women that they specifically said that they have been assaulted and raped at the borders. These are the issues that we should know about. It's one of the reasons that people cross the border on their bailed route to cross the border to save their lives, or because there is no safe and legal pathways for them to the border and go to save their countries, to save their lives. While we are here in Geneva and while we are talking, there are thousands of people in countries like Afghanistan, which we have a system of gender apartheid, that they systematically target LGBTIQ people. Many LGBTIQ people, according to the UN Special Rapporteurs on Afghanistan, have been raped, tortured, and extrajudicially executed. We have this system, and because of that, they try to cross the border and save their lives. And yes, I'm so lucky that I'm here and I'm speaking in front of you. But LGBTI people in countries like Afghanistan, they shouldn't rely on their luckiness, or they shouldn't rely on their fortune, but they should rely on the international community's willingness to protect them, which we don't have it right now. I want to keep it short because I don't have enough time, but I want to encourage the member states to establish a safe and secure pathways and extend humanitarian visas for LGBTIQ people at risk so they can go to safer countries and save their lives. And also right now, since January, many of our organizations, including our organization, have been impacted negatively because of the cut of funding. Unfortunately, since January, most of the organizations, they close their programs. They cannot provide life-saving support to the LGBT refugees and asylum seekers in transit countries like Turkey, Pakistan, and other countries. We couldn't provide any support since January to LGBTQ women and girls in Afghanistan. We couldn't provide any support to LGBTQ refugees and asylum seekers in Pakistan, in Turkey. And I think the international community must provide his support to the civil society organizations, and they should support LGBTQ refugee-led organizations. And yeah, my last recommendation is that they should support the mandate of the independent expert, SOB, and strengthen the mandate in four resources. And more importantly, I want to encourage the member states, they should read the recommendations provided in the report and turn it into actions. I heard a lot of beautiful statements on Friday by the member states, but I want to ask the member states, to what extent are you going to take these recommendations into consideration and turn them into actions? Because we LGBTI people, we LGBTIQ refugees and asylum seekers, we are tired of political statements. We heard one for many years that the Human Rights Council, and I'm here for many years, but we need action. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Raymond. And now we're going to turn into a video remark provided by Volker Turk, then High Commissioner.
The vibrancy, dynamism, and creativity of LGBTIQ+ people and communities around the world enrich our societies wonderfully. And the solidarity of broader communities, family members, friends, employee and student groups, civil society organizations, lawyers, and many others, has moved me deeply. We are united by compassion, justice, and a shared humanity. The sense of community has been central to important progress for ensuring the rights of LGBTIQ+ people in many countries. For instance, when it comes to the decriminalization of consensual same-sex relations, the adoption of anti-discrimination laws, and the recognition of gender identity and marriage equality. In several countries, intersex children are now better protected from harmful practices. And there has been a steady increase in public awareness and support for the rights of LGBTIQ+ people. Yet, the challenges are significant. Violence and discrimination are widespread in all regions. Some politicians and leaders are spreading hateful rhetoric about LGBTIQ+ people and pitting groups against each other to divide and distract. The bigotry and hatred are often amplified by vicious invective and disinformation on poorly regulated social media platforms. And we also see now discriminatory laws that curtail freedom of expression, peaceful assembly, and association for LGBTIQ+ people, for example, by banning pride marches and censoring educational materials. This is a concerted campaign to turn something fundamentally human, who we are and who we love, into a culture war. We must all stand up to counter these trends and to protect LGBTIQ+ people from violence and discrimination across all sectors of society. There is a particular responsibility for states and tech companies to tackle hate speech against LGBTIQ+ people and safeguard space for dialogue and discussion. And as human rights more broadly come under attack, it is essential for the LGBTIQ+ community to make common cause with other communities working for dignity and equality. Solidarity is crucial in order to avoid the trap of division and polarization. We will never compromise on our efforts for the human rights and dignity of everyone, everywhere. LGBTIQ+ people and communities have my full support and that of my office.
Thank you to Volker for submitting that video remark. So as I mentioned, last week Friday marked this historic moment at the Human Rights Council, where for the first time Graham Reed presented a dedicated report on forced displacement of LGBTQI+ persons. This is an overdue recognition of the global crisis facing LGBTQI communities forced to flee their homes as a result of persecution based on their sexual orientation, gender identity. The report shines a necessary light on the reality that has long remained at the margins of international protection frameworks. It reaffirms what LGBTQI+ human rights defenders and organizations have been sounding the alarm on for years, that LGBTQI+ people face unique and intersecting forms of violence, criminalization, and structural exclusion that often leave flight as the only option, and that even yet, protection is not guaranteed. Today, we are joined by Graham Reed, the UN independent expert on SOGI and a long-standing advocate for LGBTQI rights protection. And as we all know, for decades, Graham has brought rigorous analysis and deep compassion to his work, including as a scholar, an advocate, and a global expert in LGBTQI rights. His leadership has helped to elevate voices of LGBTQI+ persons seeking safety and has consistently collaborated with grassroots and frontline organizations working to respond to these urgent protection needs. Welcome, Graham. Great. So we're going to dive into a conversation about the report and kind of Graham's orientation to the state of forced displacement as it stands today for trans people. Many organizations submitted questions in advance of today's discussion. We received thoughtful contributions from across regions and sectors, and they've helped to shape the direction of the entirety of this conversation. And to make the most of this time, we combined and streamlined these questions so that themes can overlap. So let's dive in. Let's begin with the broader context of what motivated you, Graham, to dedicate this year's thematic report on LGBTQI plus forced displacement, and why now?
Okay, that's a very good question. Thank you. And I think there are multiple answers to that question. One is that it builds on pre-existing work. And in particular, I think of the Global Round Table that was organized with here in collaboration with the UNHCR and my predecessor, and the subsequent meeting that was a follow-up discussion to measure progress that took place in 2023. But that is just from my specific standpoint. Of course, there have been multiple efforts from CSOs, from other entities around the world who have been looking into this issue over many years. And so I also see the report building on that work that's reflected and evident in the quality and quantity of the submissions that we received following the call for input in preparation for this particular report. So there's that element of building on pre-existing work. Secondly, the mandate is very specific in terms of protection against violence and discrimination. And I think it's absolutely clear from the report that violence and discrimination are both the drivers of displacement and absolutely shape the experience of displacement for LGBT people around the world. I think many in the introductory remarks have alluded to both the enormity of the crisis around forced displacement. And here I'm talking generally about the astounding figures of some 122 million people who are facing forced displacement. And of that, there is a subset of individuals who have a very specific experience based on the particularities of the kinds of forms of discrimination and violence that they experience. And this group of people are very often invisible. And so I think that's another absolutely vital dimension of the report, is to bring out some of the particular circumstances that shape the experience of displacement for LGBT people around the world. That's all the more important precisely because it's so often invisible or overlooked. Now, many have mentioned some of the drivers of displacement. I would like to just mention a couple, because then again, I feel it builds on the previous reports that I did last year, for example, on the restrictions on freedom of expression, freedom of peaceful assembly, freedom of association. And the follow-up report that also looked at barriers to electoral participation. And what are the elements that I feel are particularly relevant to this report? It's the fact of increasing restrictions about expressions of public of identity in the public sphere, and so-called propaganda laws, that so-called promotion of homosexuality laws, very often coupled with restrictions on access to foreign funding. So it creates a situation in which increasingly LGBT groups are unable to advocate for themselves effectively because of all these restrictions that put in place. And very often the justification for these restrictions in law and policy are a very hostile political rhetoric that situates LGBT people as kind of social threats. And so that in and of itself renders an already vulnerable group all the more vulnerable, coupled with the necessary invisibility of individuals who are afraid of falling foul of the law or falling foul of the kind of antagonism that's generated through this hostile rhetoric, means that the drivers of displacement are all the more exaggerated and exacerbated, leading to more and more people needing to flee their homes, and yet finding themselves in a situation where there are fewer and fewer legal routes to finding safety elsewhere, and increased challenges in terms of the journey towards a safer environment, as Artemis has very vividly illustrated through his own and others' experience. Some of those kind of experiences that are unfortunately very commonplace. And then I would be remiss not to also talk about the extraordinary challenges that groups around the world are facing due to the kinds of dramatic funding cuts that have taken place, that reduces the capacity of civil society organizations to provide the kind of support that is absolutely critical in this environment. So for all those reasons, I felt it would be timely to produce this report focusing on this particular issue.
I think all of us agree. Very timely. And yeah, building on a lot of the work that you've done previously and that has been done by your predecessor, it's a critical time. I mean, resettlement is often seen as one of the most meaningful solutions for queer and trans displaced people who are facing these forms of persecution. But with global resettlement opportunities shrinking and many LGBTQI plus refugees remaining in countries with very hostile rights environments, global protection has become more urgent, as well as creative solutions to protection more than ever. What role do you see the independent expert playing in advancing safety and rights in these contexts? And also, what's the condition in this kind of moment that we're in?
So I would say that, the tools at the disposal of the independent expert are somewhat specific and in some senses somewhat limited. I do hope that the report and the very detailed recommendations that the report includes would be useful tools for civil society organizations to using in terms of their own advocacy work. I think that civil society groups who are working specifically in this area have long recognized the need to find alternative countries for safer resettlement rather than the usual suspect, given that the opportunities for safe resettlement are ever decreasing. And so, looking in creative ways, engaging with states that do not have discriminatory laws in place, where there's the possibility of adequate protections. And as I know that various DSOs have been looking in regionally specific countries that are a bit more amenable to having a safer resettlement for individuals, and that are more accessible geographically to people's countries of origin. So identifying those states, discussing the kinds of possibilities and options that are available in those states, raising awareness about the need to explicitly recognize sexual orientation and gender identity as grounds for asylum in many states. And then, again, addressing in a very difficult context the lack of resources that many DSOs are facing, in particular at this time, given the scale of the cutbacks that have taken place in terms of access to resources, coupled with the growing need for that kind of support.
Yeah, and just building on that in the context of kind of shrinking resources globally and growing hostility that we're seeing in the anti-gender movement, kind of more broadly, what approaches to kind of resources and funding do you see as most effective to ensure sustainable support for LGBTQI plus forcibly displaced people and the organizations that income?
I think something that comes across quite clearly from all the submissions that we received, and then subsequently the contents of the report, is that in many situations, civil society organizations are in the space can relate to a whole range of issues related to sexual orientation and gender identity. It's very striking to me that there's a particularly in the area of forced displacement of both refugee-led and LGBT-led and civil society organizations playing an indispensable role in various aspects. On the one hand, by advocating against the current drive that forcing refugee benefits, that is, I was very grateful for the planning that you're planning from the representative from Colombia, also the progress that actually has been made. And I think, that it's always important to bear that in mind, notwithstanding the scale of the challenges that we're currently facing. But I think you gave a very good reminder of the fact that there has been enormous progress. And much of that progress has been led by society organizations advocating within their particular context, understanding what the issues are within that particular setting, strategically navigating their in oftentimes very difficult circumstances. And so, on the one hand, the civil society organization working towards more equitable environments, working against forms of discrimination, working against forms of violence, so that the drivers of displacement are reduced in the first instance. But then also looking at the kinds of challenges that people face in transit and the role that civil society groups can play in terms of addressing that. And then also the very specific need in terms of resettlement and integration. As has been pointed out in the opening and introductory remarks, one of the distinctive features that a lot of LGBT people face is that they don't enjoy the kind of support network that other displaced people may enjoy, whether that's family or broader communities. Very often it's family that is the site of initial rejection. It's community that's the site of further discrimination and even in some instances violence. So civil society groups play an indispensable role there in terms of efforts towards integration in a country of resettlement. One of the issues that was noted in the report is that very often that people are housed in remote or in rural areas where there isn't a community of support. And so in that instance, it's very important that civil society groups, LGBT-led civil society groups, refugee-led civil society groups who understand the issues are able to address them in an effective fashion. Another gap that has been identified in the report is the issue around data collection. Now, I think in almost every report that my predecessor had compiled or that I've compiled, data collection or even can you develop the project, is data collection is always a very central challenge. How to do that safely, how to do that effectively. And of course, the gap in data is a reflection of just how vulnerable people feel for fear of disclosure and what the consequences might be for disclosing sexual orientation and gender identity. But again, there are civil society organizations, places where people can feel comfortable, feel at ease in disclosing their sexual orientation and gender identity are absolutely indispensable in terms of working together with UN agencies, with states and civil society organizations to create a better database so that one understands the scale of the problem and is able to provide this kind of resource to address the problem that is necessary in the future.
Yeah, there's so many components of this report to kind of pull apart and discuss it. It really is such an incredible overview of kind of what we are facing today. One of the things that the report clearly illuminates is the ways in which LGBTQI plus refugees and internally displaced persons often face institutional bias within mainstream protection systems, manifesting in credibility assessments shaped by harmful stereotypes, narrow understandings of identity, among other concerns. And despite commitments to inclusion, these same systems typically fall short in practice. What do you see as the most urgent actions needed to address this gap and drive meaningful institutional change?
Okay, well, I mean, at the risk of sounding like that sort of flag there of civil society, I do feel again that, one of the components there is around training in addition to it. And this can be training on the conservative, for example. In a credibility interview, that the interpreter is very often drawn from the very community that one is emerges from, and that might be for discriminatory. The kind of stereotypical perceptions of what does it mean to be gay, or what does it mean to be transgender, is that oftentimes that's based on stereotype and not on the actual lived experiences of particular individuals. In some instances, they're very culturally specific notions of what a gay or lesbian or transgender identity entails that is not universal, and yet the kinds of questions that are asked assume a kind of universality of experience that doesn't play itself out in terms of the specific experiences that individuals have for a whole range of different reasons. So, kind of coming out narratives are not necessarily applicable to people, even forms of family structure, for example, are not universally applicable. So these are all the kinds of challenges that are faced in the journey towards a safer place. And here, I think that the training component that civil society organizations can provide is vital and indispensable in terms of addressing those kinds of stereotypes that become barriers to individuals' ability to find a safer environment. I think also sometimes there's a gap between policy and then the activities of the people that you interact with in the kind of ordinary and everyday way, whether that is, as you say, in the border and the kind of pushback that might take place at border or during credibility assessment process, that individuals may not be well informed, even if there are policies in place that require an openness towards representation and data identity. So it's that kind of nuance and understanding and depth of understanding that is required in a form of ongoing training and input from civil society and refugee.
Fantastic. One of the questions that we had submitted was a very interesting question around the anti-gender movement connection to patriarchal masculinities. This question asks whether you see patriarchal masculinities as a root cause of LGBTQI plus violence and discrimination, particularly amid the rising anti-rights and right-wing movements, and how we can address this within the movements that we see today.
That's a very big picture question, and yeah. Yeah, I think, look, the anti-gender movement, as has been said by Sonia Correa, amongst others, is a multi-headed hydra, and there's many different components to it, and that's part of its effectiveness. Its ability to transform itself in different contexts, to appeal to a wide range of groups, whether secular or religious faith. But I think that it is the case that there is a particular idea of a social and gender hierarchy that's very often been upheld by the dominant discourse of anti-gender movements around the world. Why is it that questions around gender and sexuality have become such a focal point, almost a kind of shorthand for geopolitical conflict around the world? That it's become kind of language that represents two very divergent worldviews. And so I think inevitably that addressing the anti-gender movement is also about looking critically at those hierarchies of power that are threatened by the rise, by the advances that have been made in terms of securing rights and equality and eliminating discrimination and violence on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. So while the scope of the mandate is quite focused and limited in terms of the specific focus on forms of discrimination and forms of violence on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, inevitably one is engaging with these broader questions around what are some of the underlying reasons for this increased hostility towards sexual and gender minorities around the world, that's coupled with a rise in authoritarian populism, and very often becomes the language in which both the authoritarian populism appeals to a conservative support base, and also a kind of repositioning, a kind of geopolitical positioning, which we also see within the UN itself. The way in which these issues are instrumentalized for a very particular political purpose.
Yeah, fascinating response. And we don't often get to kind of grapple with these more existential questions in these forums. So I appreciate your response there. And just to close out, and then maybe we'll have time to take one or two questions where we really have to close out before the hour. But how can advocates, civil society, and multilateral institutions use this report as a real lever for change?
Okay. I hope that, this report, as with other reports, can be a tool for civil society groups to use in their advocacy. I hope that it might be a roadmap for states who are willing to engage with the report. And the report includes quite extensive recommendations and quite specific recommendations. Some of those would be achievable in some settings, and some would be aspirational in other things. So that the idea is to provide very specific and concrete steps that can be taken in order to address the problems that are outlined and the challenges that are outlined in the report. I think the other purpose of the report is to circle back to how it started, is that one of the driving motivations for doing the report is precisely the kind of invisibility of a number of the both the people seeking safer resettlement, but also the issues that they are facing. And so one of the intentions of the report is to outline as clearly as possible what the challenges are in terms of both the drivers of forced displacement, the challenges in transit, and then the difficulties of reintegration in a country of temporary or permanent resettled.
Fantastic. I feel like we could all probably chat with Graham for forever about this report. I mean, I imagine you all have a lot of questions. We probably have time for two if we keep it really succinct. So if anybody has a question, I see one hand over there and one hand over here. Okay, those are our two magical question askers. So go ahead.
I'm going to be quick. I just had a question about that because from my use, when I see that sometimes in the mapping, in the context of countries, when it's criminalized, I feel that Palestine, actually Palestinians are not in that mapping that happens. And I was wondering, this report includes us in any way, something that we don't.
Yeah, well, you have to click that so we can. Perfect. And we'll take the next question and then you can respond.
Hello, everyone. I'm Lisa. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello, everyone. I'm Lisa Barnyan. I represent sex workers at Oxford Network in Central and Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Thank you for your speeches. And my question is about interpretational discrimination, meaning when speaking about LGBT rights and discrimination against LGBT people, sometimes we don't say enough in this part with LGBT sex workers, especially trans sex workers, who face discrimination not just by their gender identity orientation, but also considering the work they do. And I would like to know if the inspection to the beginning because Dr. May I sometimes find hard, and if not, what can you do to address this question and by talking the explanation made from the work that and thank you. Thank you for this question and everything.
So I think there are two interesting questions here, both one relating to what's included and what's not included in a report, and the other is about the distinct experiences of discrimination based on a range of factors that might include sexual orientation, gender identity, but that there were also other criteria that are included. One thing I want to say about the compiling a report, and this is a kind of appeal to everybody in the room who's from civil society groups. I can't emphasize how important it is to receive submissions that detail the specific experiences that from particular regions or countries. The content of the report is determined by the submissions that are received. It's a great disappointment to me at times when there is a disproportionate number of submissions from countries and regions that are better resourced, that have vibrant civil society organizations, because it reflects the inequalities that exist around the world in terms of access to resources, in terms of organizations that are operating in those particular settings. So it is sometimes the case that there's also disproportionate representation from some regions of the world rather than others. And, that's something that would be good to address. That said, there are submissions from a range of different regions that have been included in the report, and that's very heartening, but it could also be improved and strengthened. I think one of the distinctive features that goes through like a thread in the report is that you can't talk in general terms about the experience of people based on sexual orientation and gender identity. There are a whole range of factors that would determine the relative vulnerability that people experience. And so those factors might be to do with belonging to a particular ethnic, the ways in which forms of xenophobia coexist with hostility towards people based on sexual orientation and gender identity. The employment or forms of livelihood that people engage in, such as you've mentioned, in terms of sex work, that might be stigmatized or discriminated against, would be another factor. You mentioned specifically trans sex workers. I think that, within the report, at several points, it's emphasized that trans people are very often the most vulnerable. Why? Because of inadequate and inaccurate documentation, for example. And so it is a real impediment in terms of crossing international borders. People who are visibly different, are often the targets of the most hostile responses. People who can't hide their identity or choose not to hide their identity. Those are the people who are most frequently targeted. So I hope that it comes across in the report that there are different factors that contribute to the kinds of discrimination that people face and the intensity of the discrimination and hostility that people experience.
Fantastic. We are going to wrap up so that we have enough time to kind of use the space and mingle and ask any questions that any of our amazing colleagues or Graham as we kind of move through the room exit. We did have some questions that were submitted that were related to practical inquiries of how to contact Graham or the office. There is that information is available online. It's a very long email address, so we're not going to read it out loud because it's complicated to write down, but it is available online. And if you do have any questions, you can approach one of us from Rainbow Railroad, and we could provide you with that information via email or find a way to get that information to you. Yes, just thank you, Graham. Thank you for spending the time with us today, and thank you to everybody else here who's spent the time with us to provide remarks and to speak to this report. And congratulations on the report. And we really look forward to continuing our conversation in the dialogues and side events. So thank you.